All right. Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I realize I'm the final solo presentation of the day. So I aim and aspire to keep this nice and bright and energetic and forward-looking, thought-provoking. That is my aspiration. So we're going to step outside of the US, and we're also going to step outside some of the main countries and regions that we usually talk about when we're talking about cybersecurity policy, OT security regulations, outside of the countries that we see co-sealing guidance that Matt spends his time working on. And we're going to look at emerging markets and explore what kind of OT cyber governance frameworks and policies emerging markets have in place, to the extent they have them in place. By way of brief background on me, I'm Sheila Casserly. I'm the Director of Digital Policy for the Americas at Schneider Electric. Before I joined Schneider Electric almost 4 years ago, I was working at the United Nations Development Program in Istanbul, Turkey. I was focused on private sector development and public-private partnerships, so working in a lot of emerging and developing economies. And as I got into kind of the Latin American part of my portfolio at Schneider Electric, as Brazil especially started to take off in cyber policy making, I noticed that the way people are talking about and framing cyber policy that I had learned about from working in DC was very different once I went to Brazil, and it took me back to my international development background. And that's kind of what started this stream of research on emerging market security policy. So with that, I'm going to do a bit of country by country analysis of 4 emerging market case studies. And I want to set the context for emerging markets by just briefly exploring a couple trends that are driving OT security policy, risk, and investment in emerging markets. So you will notice that many of these trends that are driving risk and investment in OT security in emerging markets are also trends driving risk and security investment in the United States and in other advanced economies. So the thing to think about in the emerging market context is a difference in scale, pace, and often a much higher share of greenfield projects, especially in the infrastructure trends. Yes, there's legacy infrastructure also in emerging markets, but in many cases, there's a lot higher share of net new infrastructure that we're talking about. Oh, not there yet. Just a few statistics to run through these and illustrate these trends in emerging markets. So supply chain diversification is having a really outsized impact on emerging markets. So countries like India, Vietnam, Mexico are really experiencing the boom of manufacturing and supply chain diversification investment. We also have a big trend of urbanization and smart cities in emerging markets. Populations are moving to the city for economic opportunity, and governments of emerging markets are, they want to facilitate sustainable urban growth through the use and deployment of digital technologies. We have a couple examples, like Dubai has already completed its 100% revamp of its water metering, replacing them with smart water meters. India also has a goal that it's pursuing to replace 250 million conventional electricity meters with smart electricity meters over the coming years in cities across India. Energy infrastructure expansion and grid modernization. The last presentation set that up well. Those trends toward more software-defined energy infrastructure, distributed energy resource are, they're happening all over the world, but really, really high share of renewables and distributed energy resources in emerging markets. India is another great example of that. India alone is on track to add 570 terawatt hours of electricity consumption annually in the next 5 years. And that is happening in parallel with a goal that India has of building, I think 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel generated electricity in the next 5 years. It's already well on its way to doing that. But just to show, the huge growth in electricity consumption alongside a real prioritization of distributed energy resources, particularly coming from solar and wind in India. That also feeds into AI. Emerging markets are no different in wanting to reap the benefits of AI, and they're seeking the compute and data centers to do so. Last year, India, Thailand, Malaysia, and Brazil, especially Brazil, were all among the top 10 recipients of data center investment. So yeah, we see that trend really playing out there as well. Resource constraints. This is both in terms of OT cyber skills as well as budgets. OT cyber skills shortages, plague everyone. We have the same skill shortage here in the US, but again, just it's an especially pronounced problem in emerging markets, and that also goes for budget constraints. We have, some few lucky exceptions in high income emerging economies like Saudi Arabia and UAE, but generally, these are, of course, markets that have really constrained budgets that are spread across lots of different development priorities, putting a further damper on OT security capacity. And then lastly, geopolitics, of course, as security practitioners and policymakers, geopolitics is top of mind for everyone, but they kind of manifest in a unique way in emerging markets. You'll sometimes hear the term global swing states applied to emerging markets, reflecting how emerging markets do not want to be beholden to great power competition, and they want to again reap the benefits of cooperation with everyone in a way that advances their own unique development and sovereignty goals. And sovereignty is another thing that is alive and well, and I kind of bucket within geopolitics. We hear it a lot coming from the European context, but it is yes, again, alive and well in emerging markets, Indo-Pacific, Latin America, a growing theme. And that, of course, impacts what these governments are, what technology they're willing to buy, which stakeholders they're listening to as they're developing policy. So I have, as I started the lighting turned out a little oddly here, but in order to dig into how a few different case study markets are approaching OT cybersecurity policy, I use this kind of simple 4-part framework. I first started with ease of compliance. When I looked at my case study emerging markets, I asked first, okay, is there a regulatory framework in place at all? If so, how difficult is it to comply with? How serious is enforcement? How much time, effort, money is required to comply? I also looked at standards acceptance. To what extent does their policy or regulatory framework align with international consensus-based technical standards? And because of the importance of the ISA IEC 62443 suite of standards to the OT cybersecurity community, I gave a kind of particular lens on that standard. Just for anyone who might not be aware, that is a cybersecurity standard or a suite of standards for cybersecurity of industrial and automation control systems. There are subcomponents that cover everything from requirements, but standards for manufacturers like Schneider Electric, as well as substandards for system integrators and for asset owner operators themselves. And then I got into these last two metrics of accessibility to regulators and engagement style, because beyond compliance, we also want to be able to shape and influence policy and regulations, even if it's already in place, especially if it's not in place. We want to be able to participate in the policymaking process and offer our perspective. So I also added these two dimensions in my assessment of emerging market policy. So let's get into 4 different case studies of OT security policy in a few markets. We're going to look at Brazil, Saudi Arabia, India, and Indonesia. I chose these markets because they represent geographic diversity, regional influence in their own right, They're all economically significant places where multinationals are certainly doing business and probably have large operations in manufacturing. And they also represent a range of approaches to OT cyber policy making. So present an interesting array of possibilities. So firstly, Brazil. I won't cover every single detail. You can read through the slides later, and happy to talk through any of them. But there are a few things for each of the countries that I want to hone in on. For Brazil, it is, yes, it's characterized by a low burden and a high dialogue value. I think it's captured really well by a single phrase in the draft national cybersecurity legislation that's currently working its way through the Brazilian Senate. The statutory draft text calls directly for a celebration of public-private partnerships. And I think that captures absolutely the Brazilian spirit, and it also captures truly what they want to do with cyber policy making. They want to develop this openly, transparently, in deep partnership with everyone. And that is, they also, aspire to having a regulatory framework that is easy to comply with, and yes, open for dialogue. The thing I want to point out about that new legal framework that's, again, still in draft right now, is that kind of put it against the backdrop of some emerging and developing cooperation between EU and Brazil, especially, or even just this year, EU and Brazil penned a data adequacy agreement. And then just within the last week, within the last few days, they also signed a digital partnership agreement. So leveling up their cooperation on digital to a much more strategic level. And I really would not be surprised to see elements of, maybe many elements of the European Union's Cyber Resilience Act appear in the follow-on regulations that come out of Brazil's regulatory framework. So one thing to pay attention to, and certainly to get engaged with if that worries you at all. The other thing I want to point out for Brazil is the importance of development banks. That applies not only to, it applies broadly to emerging and developing economies, but Brazil is, when you go to any cyber policy conversation in Brazil and in Latin America broadly, you will always find many people from development banks there. That is a kind of, particularly for emerging markets, a source of influence and engagement. Oops, I think the battery's low on that. A source of influence and, or is it working? Okay, it's working. The source of influence and an engagement that you, of course, don't really work with or engage with when you're talking about advanced markets. And then lastly, just so I chose Brazil as a representative example of Latin America. Nascent is the name of the game in Latin America, Latin American cyber policy, and certainly OT cyber policy. So it's a really great time to go get engaged in Latin America. There is one exception, that is Chile. Chile passed a national cyber framework law for critical infrastructure in 2024. And I think the main thing I'd like to point out about the Chilean framework is they have, for their electricity sector, chosen to adopt NERC-CIP as their model for electricity sector cybersecurity in Chile. I don't know, for reasons that we saw in the last presentation, that that's a model that we necessarily, I mean, certainly as practitioners, but in general, want to see proliferate in its current form, considering the new energy technology landscape. But just as I give that as an interesting illustration of, which models companies or countries are looking to when they're developing their OT cyber frameworks. Let's move on to a much different picture. That is Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia is a very interesting model to study in depth. It is not only one of the most comprehensive OT security it not only has one of the most comprehensive OT regulatory stacks of any of these markets that we're looking at today, but really in general in the world. For Saudi Arabia, I think it's important to put it in perspective of what's driving that. Saudi Arabia has this Vision 2030, which is very ambitious plan to modernize and diversify its economy off of oil and develop sectors like technology, tourism, and renewable energy. And Saudi Arabia sees cybersecurity and domestic cybersecurity capacity as central strategic enablers of achieving that vision while maintaining centralized control. And that is another critical feature of Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabian cyber policy and OT cyber policy. It is centralized under the National Cybersecurity Authority, NCA. Everything related to cybersecurity regulation and enforcement stems from NCA. The regulatory stack starts with the essential cybersecurity controls. Everyone operating in Saudi Arabia is required to comply with these. And then kind of depending on what type of service or product you're offering, you have additional lists of security controls that you layer on top of these essential cybersecurity controls. So there's cloud cybersecurity controls, data cybersecurity controls, critical systems, security controls like national security systems, and then there's OT cybersecurity controls. The OT cybersecurity controls, when I apply my standards acceptance assessment, it goes 62443 takes you quite a bit of the distance toward compliance with the operational technology cyber controls in Saudi Arabia, but there are some unique considerations that are beyond the technical controls that 62443 will provide. So there are some kind of cultural controls, like having a minimum number of Saudi nationals in cyber roles in Saudi Arabia. But still, for the most part, 62443 does help you get quite a bit of the distance, both as an OT vendor, OT system integrator, and OT owner operator. One other thing in Saudi that's interesting to look at is this regulatory framework for managed service providers. And this is where you see, related to that centralized control and Saudi's vision of cybersecurity as a strategic enabler. There is a licensing requirement for managed service providers that requires a localization of pretty much everything. You have to localize data, localize ownership and headquarters, localize your workforce. There are some Saudiization rules that require or mandate a specific number of Saudi nationals work as analysts in your SOC. And then on top of that, there is a requirement that the Saudi government has 24/7 access to your SOC. So these are pretty much, by design, prohibitive rules that Saudi has in place that really only allow for a very, select handful of Saudi managed service providers to operate. And indeed, there are only 4 that have achieved this or, received this license, and 2 that really, are taking the lion's share of managed security services work in Saudi Arabia. One of them is essentially the commercial arm of the National Cybersecurity Authority in Saudi Arabia, and the other one is Cyberani, which is the managed service provider arm of Saudi Aramco. And Saudi Aramco also makes the list here, although it's of course a company. It makes the list of national regulations just by nature of its sheer size and importance to the Saudi economy. It accounts for about 40% of Saudi Arabia's GDP, and it has its own set of standards. In addition to the national standards required by Saudi Arabia, there are Saudi Aramco has its own additional set of controls, and there you do find in their controls for system integrators and for vendors and for the components and systems that they're actually procuring. They do align largely to 62443. So from the Saudi Aramco perspective, we see a kind of higher, I would give it a higher level of standards acceptance. All right, let's move on to our next market. And please give me a time check if I'm 5 minutes. Okay, great. So India is fascinating. I had the opportunity to spend 5 weeks in India on a research fellowship this spring. researching Indian cyber policy, particularly for the electricity sector. And my honest takeaway was that after 5 weeks, I was more confused about cyber policy in India than when I arrived. And I think that is an absolutely apt learning and takeaway. That is the reality of, India in so many ways, and Indian cyber policy certainly. One of the things that makes ease of compliance low in India, it's not like Saudi Arabia where it's a comprehensive regime that's highly prescriptive. It's that authorities are so fragmented across different agencies and regulatory bodies. It can be very hard to just keep up with all of them and understand, which one, are guidelines mandatory, even though they're guidelines and they're referred to in another regulation by another regulator. There's sometimes interlinkages, sometimes not at all. And knowing who to address, who to talk to understand these things can be difficult, which is an important feature of engagement style in India. Having an individual relationship is pretty much necessary to understand, what a word means when it's said by that individual in that agency. Two interesting cases specific to the regulations in India. Also, great background in the last presentation on that. The Indian Central Electricity Authority, the electricity sector regulator in India, has drafted a power sector cyber regulation, still pending. But it addresses a lot of the problems that the last presentation raised about how, like NERC-CIP as an example, or how the authorities we have in the US it's difficult with how things are set up, and with the new distributed nature, software-defined nature of energy technology, to have a governance framework for the cybersecurity of that technology. Not saying this is a perfect rule, but it does address a modern energy landscape, getting down to much more digital, software-defined energy technology. It calls for SBOMs there are obligations for both energy OT vendors as well as for asset owner operators and system integrators. The SBOM guidance SBOMs that are mandated by the cyber rule and the accompanying corresponding guidelines, I think, are pretty interesting to look at as well, because it is not only a software bill of materials that India has published guidelines on, but their guidelines go further to address hardware bill of materials, crypto and quantum readiness bill of materials, and AI bill of materials. And I just, there was the update to the minimum elements of an SBOM here in the US late last year, that had a short paragraph addressing the fact that maybe in future iterations of that guidance, we'll want to look at AI and maybe some fields that are going to be necessary to address AI in a bomb. Not endorsing this as great guidance, and in some ways, from what I hear about people who are greater bomb experts than myself, certainly, a lot of it can be unworkable. But the fact that they went forward with it and put something out there, I think, still provides good food for thought. And anyone who's interested in the bomb space, I think it is worth looking at and seeing if there are some things that we can take away and just think about in a different way. I'll close on my last country market, or my last country case study, that is Indonesia. And I think the key things that I want to say about Indonesia are, firstly, that it can be characterized in one word, and that is ambiguous. It has critical infrastructure cybersecurity regulations in place. It mandates minimum security controls for owner-operators of critical infrastructure and requires 24-hour incident reporting to sector-specific certs. But to date, there's no evidence that these minimum security controls have been published or exist, or that their corresponding sector-specific certs exist. So, what is actually expected of owner-operators and their suppliers to comply is very unclear. The other part of this slide I want to point out is a pending cybersecurity and resilience bill in Indonesia. And this is interesting because it introduces obligations for manufacturers of products with digital elements. So for students of the EU Cyber Resilience Act, you'll know that products with digital elements is the foundation of that very impactful consequential law. So We see now the second case, but we haven't seen it concretely in Brazil. But again, it looks like it's potentially going in that direction. And here it is very concretely in Indonesia, pulling from, inspired by EU CRA. Given the, again, ambiguous landscape in Indonesia and just general capacity constraints, geographic constraints, it's a nation of thousands of islands and 700 plus languages. So enforcement is difficult by anyone's standards, and even for the most mature cyber agencies and enforcement authorities. But just to see that kind of appearing is something to pay attention to. So I will close here after our exploration of different regimes with just a few reminders and recommendations. These pertain to both practitioners and policymakers. And I will flesh these policy recommendations out certainly into more detail, but these are just some high-level things to think about. We saw that single emerging market compliance and engagement influence strategy is not necessarily going to be effective. These are all countries with different priorities and motivations, and of course authorities. So looking at them as disparate markets, which they are, not necessarily just copying from US or EU, is important. And I gave a few examples too. Is there something here in the US that we could take a look at when we look elsewhere, looking at the bomb guidance or even some of Saudi Arabia's efforts to build its domestic cybersecurity industry? Just in studying these different frameworks, I think again, it's just thought-provoking for what might be effective or not here in the U.S. Looking beyond national regulations and regulators, we saw examples of large companies like Aramco at a multilateral development banks, multilateral institutions having an impact. That's something from the U.S. perspective. These last recommendations really get more into kind of foreign policy and diplomacy recommendations, but influencing or leveraging U.S. influence in multilateral development banks to drive OT security controls in procurement and policy and capacity building in the countries where we are giving money. Lastly, the second to last one, on 62443, we saw that it means something in Saudi Arabia. It does mean something in the power sector rules in India, which I didn't address, but and then also for Brazil and Indonesia that are going in the direction of CRA. 62443 is quite aligned with CRA, where it's also moving in that direction in the standardization. So this is still a strong baseline and something that for US we can resource engagement around when engaging abroad. And that's related to the last and final point. Although there are some regulatory frameworks already in place in a couple of the example markets I mentioned, there's still a window to shape frameworks across much of the emerging and certainly developing world. So a good opportunity for practitioners and policy teams to get involved. And for the US itself too, we're in an era of commercial diplomacy, especially prioritizing AI infrastructure build out. OT and the underlying infrastructure, of course, will enable a sustainable, resilient AI infrastructure system where we want to sell it, and also supports our goal of being trusted technology partners. So incorporating OT security into that trade and commercial diplomacy tools is going to be to our benefit. So final point is go get engaged.
All right. Thank you very much. Any questions? Any questions? All right.
Hey, Sheila. Great
Hello,
talk as always.
Thank you.
I'm curious, you mentioned Indonesia, they were using the CRA language in there. As you were looking at all these other case studies, was there any sign that it felt like people were copying and pasting CRA and tweaking, trying to intentionally align with Europe to kind of get the market benefit? Or did it feel like people are kind of maybe naturally landing on the same conclusions or copying here, but really adding a bunch, right? How does that relationship work with the big players in the emerging markets?
Yeah, so Indonesia was the only case study that I have seen, and I have explored others beyond these markets that I highlighted here. It's the only market that I've seen where it puts in that literal, quite a literal, copy paste of CRA into some of its own proposed legislation and regulation. in the case of Indonesia, it's like, hey, that's an advanced market doing something about this, and we will copy that because that's what an advanced market is doing, honestly. For Brazil, while they haven't explicitly called out CRA anywhere, just again looking at that kind of there's been a long-standing trend of EU Brazil cooperation and growing trend, and I can see that leading to CRA. And for Brazil, I think it's in a more, it's not necessarily that from a copy paste perspective, but rather really trying to get it right and seeing product security as critical to cybersecurity of infrastructure. So not necessarily copy pasting it, but I think especially after the standardization is complete, and seeing how things shake out. Brazil's still a few years away from actually instituting anything. I think they're really watching CRA closely because they see it as, achieving some of the same outcomes they want to achieve, but it's not necessarily just because they're copying it, copy paste. Exactly. Yeah.
Any other questions? I have one for you. So
please.
Are those the right case studies to consider? Should like Taiwan or maybe even Philippines, given the threat actor of concern, is Taiwan or the Philippines or somebody who's actually actively being targeted by China a better case study?
I appreciate that question. Philippines, I don't know. I have not looked at the Filipino case study or what they're doing in terms of OT security. So I will.
But Taiwan, clearly.
Taiwan, I guess the reason I'm happy nobody asked this question. I also purposely didn't define emerging markets, but I was trying to keep this on more of a development, kind of from a development, social and economic development level and lens, what is happening with OT security in that respect, as opposed to development of the OT security and security frameworks themselves. So I guess Taiwan, I didn't address because I don't necessarily bucket it as an emerging market. But all of this is fluid and flexible in some extent.
Okay.
But I like the Philippines case study, so I'll look at that.